I, what? I just hit record. Oh, okay. I'm sure Paul's many fans are excited about the book that he's doing this year, Slaughterhouse-Five. We talked about what book to do this year about a year ago, and I particularly wanted this book because I was interested in shortly after the reunification of the two Germanys and was stunned at the damage that still existed at that point. And it's, you know, one of the cultural tragedies of history. As I understand it, Dresden was not even a strategic target, but it was the determination of a British Air Force general that led to its devastation. And I'm going to turn this over to Mallory O'Connor to introduce Paul, but it's wonderful the way this fit into the general theme of book banning that Mallory has been doing this whole term.
Well, thank you, Roy, for that introduction. And this is session 6. So we've come up to our final session of the Contemporary Heresies program. And I'm sure that Paul Ortiz is a familiar figure to the ILR audience, but let me just mention a few facts about our presenter for this final session of the Banned Books class. Paul wears several hats at the University of Florida. In addition to teaching courses in African American history, Latina and Latinx history, comparative ethnic studies, U.S. South, labor, social movement theory, oral history, digital humanities, ethnography, and a few other topics. He's also director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida and president of the United Faculty of Florida. How do you have time to do all of that, Paul? His book, Emancipation Betrayed, The Hidden History of Black Organizing and White Violence in Florida, from Reconstruction to the Bloody Election of 1920, was the recipient of the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Book Prize. He was the co-editor of the award-winning oral history, Remembering Jim Crow, African Americans Tell About Life in the Jim Crow South. And most recently, Paul published An African American and Latinx History of the United States, a revolutionary, politically charged revisionist history arguing that Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, and otherwise known as the Global South, were crucial to the development of the Americas as we know it. Ortiz challenged the notion of westward progress as exalted by widely taught formulations like manifest destiny and Jacksonian democracy, and shows how placing African American, Latinx, and indigenous voices unapologetically front and center transforms American history into one of the working class organizing themselves against imperialism. I think you can understand why this book was banned. Dr. Ortiz is currently in Washington, D.C., where he was awarded a Distinguished Scholar Fellowship to work this summer with Dr. Ibram Kendi at the National Archive Research Center. He will be joining us today from Washington to talk about Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five and the costs of war. Please welcome Dr. Paul Ortiz.
Thank you so much, Mallory. Thank you so much, Roy, for the very kind introductions. It's always a privilege and an honor to be back with colleagues and friends at the ILR and OCAMIC at Gainesville. As Mallory mentioned, I've been in DC this summer working in the National Archives, which is normally a very quiet, solemn place where the Bill of Rights and other founding documents of our nation are stored. But the National Archives has been anything but quiet this summer. If you've been following the news about President Trump's papers and the FBI and the National Archives. It's amazing every day to be part of a place where history is stored, but also where history is being made. And I was sharing with Mallory earlier, I actually biked back down to the archives on Saturday. Normally it's closed. This past weekend to see if I could catch a glimpse of those presidential papers kind of rolling in. There were a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of people, cameras, a lot of protesters, but the staff of the National Archives take their roles very seriously. Their argument is that you can't have a functioning democracy or a republic unless you have access to that state's documents from the past. And they feel very strongly it's a very mission-driven place. So it's really inspiring to be there and really inspiring to be with you today. As Roy mentioned earlier, we couldn't have picked a more timely topic, a timely book. Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five is one of the most heavily banned books in American literature, especially by school districts. I'll talk about a little bit about that. And one of the most famous bans, and actually a time when Slaughterhouse-Five was burned very publicly in a school district in South Dakota. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about too is to get us to really situate Slaughterhouse-Five, not just as a book that came out in 1969, a book that had a tremendous immediate impact. A Hollywood film was produced, and by the way, that film is really good. If you haven't had a chance to see it, the Slaughterhouse-Five film came out in 1973, and Vonnegut loved it. It was very well done. It sticks mainly with the themes of the novel, takes a little bit of license, because it's on the big screen, of course. The other thing I want to mention, I'll do my normal caveat, because I know we have literary scholars out there. And just to remind you, I was not trained as a literary scholar. I'm a historian who loves books. And I really believe that novels in particular help us understand the times that we live in. In fact, oftentimes novelists do a better job than historians than explaining why we got to a certain point in our history. And I wanted to read a passage from a book review that one of my mentors at Duke University wrote many years ago about this interesting dichotomy between novelists and historians. According to Professor Goodwin, are novelists taking as their premise the condition of man, tormented, unfulfilled, endlessly striving, have produced a literature of American endurance under tragedy. In contrast, our historians, as guardians of the national covenant, have determined to find an explanation for our progress. Their song is one of celebration. The American tribe, portrayed by our historians, is triumphant without tragic dimension. Those humans called Americans have somehow been spared the vicissitudes elsewhere afflicting the species. Two literatures, two Americas, a puzzle indeed. And that was from Lawrence Goodwin, doing a review actually of a David Bryan Davis historical book. So many of us have been on this literary journey together for quite a few years now. And I think we started, Roy, with William Faulkner's Intruder in the Dust. We've read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We've read To Kill a Mockingbird, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Toni Morrison's Beloved, and so many more. And Roy reminded me that we need to also start thinking about next summer, where we go from here. And so let's do that. Let's make this kind of a fun exercise. But while I'm transitioning to my screen share, I have some slides to share with you. I also want to give a shout out to a really special person who actually made it, today's presentation possible. And that's my high school AP English teacher, Mr. Don Bidwell. And I don't know if Mr. Bidwell is here with us this morning or this afternoon. It'll be morning for him because he lives near Seattle. But I told him we get a recording of this presentation to him if he couldn't make it. And the reason he's important is that he's the one that introduced me to Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five my senior year in high school. It was at a time when I was not a really serious student, and this book just really rocked my world. Reading this in a military town, I grew up in Bremerton, Washington, a shipyard town. You know, I was the son of a veteran who himself was the son of a veteran. This book was really earth-shaking for me because it explained to me so much of the milieu that I grew up in, where war had had such a devastating impact, not just on the during the time that war had been fought, whether it was World War II or Vietnam or Korea, et cetera, but the lingering effects of war that I saw manifested around me, you know, domestic violence, suicide, you know, troubling relationships, people suddenly breaking down in the middle of a street or a department store. A lot of these things went on around us as kids, and we had no explanation for them. And I remember when I read this book, it was like an epiphany. It was really liberating for me, actually, to read a book that was very honest about the legacies and the impacts and the costs of war. And many of you know that I myself am a combat military veteran. I'm very active in Gainesville Veterans for Peace. Kurt Vonnegut, by the way, was a very close friend of many members of the original Veterans for Peace, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which transitioned to Vets for Peace later in the late 70s and 80s. But Kurt Vonnegut used his experiences as a soldier, as a combat soldier, and as a prisoner of war to really, from that point on, coming back, especially during the Vietnam War. Those of you who remember the anti-war movement, remember Kurt Vonnegut as being in the forefront of that movement. And it's quite interesting when you think about other World War II combat veterans, people like Norman Mailer, people like Paul Fussell, who we'll hear from in a little bit. Many of the World War II combat veterans ended up being at the forefront of the anti-war movement during the Vietnam years. And we'll talk a little bit about why that was the case today, because it also gives us a sense of why this book, Slaughterhouse-Five, has been so heavily banned. It's challenging. When you read the book, there's humor in it, there's science fiction, there's a tremendous depth of humanity, and it's challenging to people, to our nation, to our whole way of life. Vonnegut wanted to write a novel that resonated with ordinary readers, and I really think he nailed it. Kurt Vonnegut, a little bit about him. It's quite interesting. As far as he tells us, his ancestors who came from Europe, primarily from what became Germany, were always either agnostics or atheists. And this plays a very important part of his life. And along with Isaac Asimov, he was one of the real leaders of the American Humanist Association for many years. He was the honorary president actually after Isaac Asimov stepped down. And that backdrop of his ideology of humanism plays a really very important role in Slaughterhouse-Five, this idea of of trying to create a moral universe without religion, without a God. Not that Vonnegut argued people away from religion. In fact, when people would ask him, hey, what can I do to like get on track or be happier, he'd often tell people, hey, join a church. But not because of the religion, but because of the sense of community that he felt churches and synagogues and mosques provided. I want to start with the takeaway points, because this again gives us a sense of why this book is so timely today, but also why it was banned, why it has been so heavily banned, because the timeliness and the banning really go together. And unfortunately now, as you know, we live in a time where the idea of banning books, of shutting down ideas, of making certain ideas illegal, like critical race theory, which I teach, making that illegal and banning books has really come back into vogue by states, by school districts. And These three quotes, and I will send this lecture to Mallory, so you don't have to worry about taking notes or anything. You'll be able to look at it. These three quotes are from three different points in Vonnegut's life, which illustrate the challenges that Kurt Vonnegut has for us as readers and as human beings and as American citizens, I might add. The first quote, Vonnegut was asked by Harper's Magazine to cover the Republican National Convention in Miami. Many of you remember that convention. It was tumultuous. It results in the nomination of, not surprisingly, of Richard Nixon. There's, everyone is there who's anyone, the millionaires, the political leaders, protesters. And Vonnegut writes this incredible piece, this overview of the Republican National Convention. And he's trying to get at this question of who Americans are, what Americans think about themselves or ourselves versus how the rest of the world sees us. And that's where the first quote comes from. If I were a visitor from another planet, and again, the science fiction kind of symbolism, I'll talk about that in a few minutes. He said throughout the convention, he said, we Americans like to think that we're kind of a kind, gentle, fair people, but we don't look that way from an objective outside standpoint. And we need to find a way to turn that around. I would call the robbing and killing of American Indians genocide. And that idea now is out of bounds in many school districts in this country. I can number on my one hand the number of school districts that openly talk about Native American history as a history of genocide. But here Kurt Vonnegut is saying this in 1972. So I want us to situate him historically. It was a time of mass movements. Again, the anti-war movement, the Black Power movement, the Chicano movement, women's rights, reproductive movement. The second quote comes a little later. Vonnegut was a very popular speaker in high schools, in colleges, even middle schools. And people loved his kind of down-to-earth delivery. He was very funny, but he was very serious too. And so he could give a talk which was humorous, but then there'd be a payoff in the middle or towards the end. And what he was trying to get across in Slaughterhouse-Five was that, look, World War II, no war is a good war. But Vonnegut believed World War II was a war that we needed to fight. He believed that the German nation personified, especially in the Holocaust, the war on the Soviet Union, the racial supremacy. Vonnegut believed that Germany had to be fought during World War II. There was just no way around that. But he believed that because World War II, because of the character of World War II, it created a moral trap for the United States so that the US keeps reliving World War II over and over and over again. So Manuel Noriega becomes Adolf Hitler in 1989. Saddam Hussein becomes Adolf Hitler in 1990. The leaders of Afghanistan become Nazis in the early 2000s during the War on Terror. Excuse me. And Vonnegut tells us we've got to get out of that mindset. World War II happened in a certain place and time. We had to fight the war, but this is not World War II. He told people Vietnam is not Germany. This is not, let's stop reliving this. This is what makes us so problematic. And Vonnegut is very much a critic of the idea of American innocence. And you see this throughout Slaughterhouse-Five and the character of Billy Pilgrim. And Vonnegut tells us that one of the things that makes us so dangerous as a people is we don't interrogate our motivations, our idea of innocence, and we need to come clean with that. The final takeaway thought is something very near and dear to Vonnegut's heart. He was a very strong supporter of the civil rights movement, and he was a very strong, fierce foe of racism. And basically, he talks here about the tremendous sacrifices that African Americans have had to make in the United States just to be here. And I think this is very profound. It's a very profound insight. And it's something, and keep in mind, this was to be Vonnegut's, or this ended up being his final lecture. He wrote the lecture out. He was being honored in Indianapolis, but he died before he could give the lecture. And so his son, Mark Vonnegut, delivered it in his place. A very famous incident in 1973. A young English teacher, about age 26, age 27, Bruce Severy, assigned Slaughterhouse-Five in his sophomore English class in North Dakota. And part of the reason he assigned the book was that he was having a hard time getting through to his students. They just weren't getting anything out of the books they had been reading. They seemed bored, they seemed turned off. Slaughterhouse-Five had just come out. It was a bestseller. It got incredible reviews. That's the amazing thing. A lot of the books we've been talking about over the past several years, when they first were released, you know, Herman Melville's Moby Dick is a great example. It got terrible reviews, got panned. And some of them only became popular in the years after the author passed away. Not true of Slaughterhouse-Five. It immediately resonated, it immediately found an audience. I mean, Hollywood had a movie out within 3 years, just imagine that. And it was a good movie too. So this teacher, Bruce Severy, picks up the novel and assigns it, and immediately his class in sophomore English, Mr. Bidwell will appreciate this, immediately get excited. He says C&D students were suddenly writing A papers. It was transformative for these students' lives. Unfortunately, there was one student that didn't like the book. By now, you know, if you've read the book, it has cursing in it. It has sexual sequences. It has a lot of discussions about violence, a lot of, you know, really kind of disturbing scenes. And so immediately the school board got in on the Bruce Severy's case. The wife of a local school board phoned this English teacher, Mr. Severy, and called him, quote, an old scumbag, a piece of garbage that flew into North Dakota. He was from California, a perverter of her children's minds. And I think this language, we hear this really bitter, angry language used against teachers today in states like Florida. And it's important for us to understand why that's really happening again. So subsequently, the school board actually went to confiscate all of the copies of this book of Slaughterhouse-Five from Mr. Severy's students. But lo and behold, most of the students had somehow lost their copies of Slaughterhouse-Five. And so the school board went on a wild goose chase, if you will, to actually find these copies of the book. They searched the students' lockers, they searched their persons, they called their homes. They finally came up with about 30 copies of Slaughterhouse-Five, and when they got them into a bulk, they directed their school janitor to burn the books in the school furnace, in the heating furnace. But the kids, you know, and this is an interesting thing, because I remember, again, Don Bidwell assigning us Slaughterhouse-Five when I was a senior in high school, and we couldn't buy the book in my hometown. We couldn't, it was not in our library in Bremerton. We had to go to Seattle. I had to get on a ferry, go to Seattle and get the book, because it was not offered in my local, you know, bookstore market. And that was back when there was a lot of used bookstores in the US. Luckily now they're making a resurgence, right? It's very important. But yeah, essentially the students really rebelled against this. And they said, you know, why are these adults trying to take away a book that we're finally excited to read? You know, why is that? And so there was quite a struggle in the small Dakota town. It made the New York Times. Kurt Vonnegut, by the way, responded directly to the school board in 1973 after they had burned Slaughterhouse-Five. He was appalled by the episode, and he tried to explain to the school board that, you know, I know there's a lot of uncomfortable parts of the book that you may kind of blanch at, but it's really real life. You know, in real life, people curse. In real life, there's tragedy. Again, getting back to Lawrence Goodwin's quote, real life is not all roses and happiness. There's events like the firebombing of Dresden, which I lived through. And so he tried to get back to the school board to explain to them why reading of books like Slaughterhouse-Five was so very important to do for high school students. Now, they never responded to him. And after the New York Times did the article, the local school board pretty much shut down the media and just refused to talk about it until many, many years later. So where's Kurt Vonnegut? Really one of the most incredible writers in our nation's history. I mentioned earlier, he was the descendant of agnostics, of atheists. His father and grandfather were architects. There were many scientists, engineers in the family. In Indianapolis, actually, there are still buildings that were designed by Kurt Vonnegut's elders and ancestors. But by the time he was a young boy, he was born in 1922, and then certainly during the Great Depression, the family really fell on hard times and was having a very difficult time making it economically. And in fact, his mother actually herself took to writing independently to try to raise money to keep the family afloat. His mother was very depressed. There's also a long history of mental illness within the families, within Kurt Vonnegut's family. Mark Vonnegut, some of you are familiar with the book that Mark Vonnegut wrote after having an episode we used to call a nervous breakdown. But Vonnegut grew up with this, and he, especially in the 70s, began to talk more about this issue of depression within his family and the fact that his mother had committed suicide shortly before he was deployed to Europe. And he wanted people to know the role that Ida Young, the family's African-American domestic worker, had played in his upbringing. He said, quote, that Ida Young gave him a decent moral instruction and was exceedingly nice to him, was as great an influence on him as anybody. He described her as humane and wise, and added that, quote, the compassionate, forgiving aspects of his beliefs came from her. And so it was a difficult, challenging childhood. The Depression had a devastating impact on the family. This is another thing that shaped Slaughterhouse-Five. And Kurt Vonnegut continued to talk about being a child of the Great Depression and what that did to the American character. And he believed it had a terrible impact that had kind of a lasting impact and really impacted relationships between grandparents and parents and parents and children. So Vonnegut eventually goes into the military. He initially was being trained for a pretty rarefied skill set. And then as the war picked up, he actually was trained as infantry scout. And we just have a few pictures of him. And it's just amazing. I would look at these and how young he was, how young he looks, because most of the photographs I'd ever seen of Kurt Vonnegut through most of my life were those that were taken after he was a very famous author. Why does Slaughterhouse-Five, why was it written the way it was written? And why is so much of the literature of World War II, whether we think of Joseph Heller's Catch-22, Norman Mailer's Naked and the Dead, John Oliver Killen's, and then we heard the thunder, or then they heard the thunder. Why did it take the form that it did? And the first thing we have to come to grips with is the subtitle of the book, A Children's Crusade. And why does Vonnegut call it, why does he subtitle it The Children's Crusade? Now, those of you who read through the book already know the answer. I'm going to read a short passage from Slaughterhouse in just a minute to kind of remind us. But Paul Fussell really wants us to remember, and Fussell was a platoon leader in World War II. He became an English professor and became a great writer in his own right. And he actually wants us to remember, if you look at the image on his book, The Boys' Crusade, that language of crusade. And Fussell wants us to remember that the people that fought this war, many of them were children. And that's something that we've somehow conveniently forgotten. But people like Fussell, people like Kurt Vonnegut, wanted us to keep that in mind. Many of the people who fought World War II were children, either from the US, from the Soviet Union, from Europe, from Africa, from Asia. Some soldiers were as young as 11 or 12 years old. Some of the colonial troops that fought for France and Great Britain were very young teenagers. They would have been considered, high school freshmen by American standards. But another reason why Slaughterhouse-Five was written the way it was written, another reason why Catch-22 was written the way it was written, why Naked and the Dead was written the way it was written, why James Jones's From Here to Eternity and the Thin Red Line were written the way they were written is World War II, again, these are novelists. These are men who were combat veterans primarily. Then they wrote about the war. And then there's World War II in the history textbooks, which I don't even recognize after I read a book like Slaughterhouse-Five or The Naked and the Dead, because the real war is more like Operation Cobra than a kind of a celebratory passage in a U.S. history text. And those of you familiar with World War II know what a tragedy Operation Cobra was. In the Samuel Proctor Oral History program, we have interviews with men who were there on that day, that terrible, dreadful day. And one of our narrators, who was a platoon commander, a platoon leader, remembers looking up, and we have hundreds of remembrances like this across the country from different oral history programs. This one is from Lieutenant Murray Pulver, but the terrible, dreadful moment when the men looked up, getting ready to lead the assault, and they realized that their own B-17 bombers had opened their bomb doors too soon, and that they were going to be bombed, not just once, but twice. The highest ranking general killed on the US side in World War II was killed during Operation Cobra by his own bombers. And so Paul Fussell, this is why Paul Fussell titles his book, Doing Battle, The Making of a Skeptic. And Fussell said that people like Vonnegut, people like Naylor, people like myself came back to the US in the late 40s after the war, used the GI Bill, and we were mission driven. We were determined to try to teach people about how bad World War II was, but more importantly, to try to raise new generations of students who would find ways other than war to solve our problems. Fussell served in the south of France. Almost his entire platoon was wiped out. The leadership from above was terrible. The intelligence was terrible. And so Fussell tells us, look, he said, look, I became an English professor because I wanted to find an immediate way to get across to my students about the horrors of war. There's nothing here to celebrate, to kind of, kind of lift up as a cool kind of activity. War is hell. And this is, I think, the real takeaway from Slaughterhouse-Five and so many novels of that time. Now, I wanted to share with you a little bit of what Kurt Vonnegut went through. There's a letter, and I can put the URL in the chat once we move to Q&A. Kurt Vonnegut actually wrote this incredible letter to his family as soon as he could write a letter, as soon as the war had ended and the Soviets and the Americans and Brits had liberated that part of Germany where he was a POW. And Vonnegut, his experiences, not only in the Battle of the Bulge, which were horrific, but even surviving, being on a prisoner of war train, having it bombed by the Brits, and many men, scores of POWs were killed. Many people died on the way from Belgium to Dresden, Germany. And so all of that is in Kurt Vonnegut's letter to his family. And I'll like I said, I'll share the link with Mallory, and she can share it with you. The 106th has a very tragic role in the Battle of the Bulge. It's the forward unit. It's not incredibly well led. It's taken by surprise. We should have known, the US should have known, the British should have known that Germans were building up this incredible offensive. They didn't. It was a failure of intelligence. And so Kurt Vonnegut ends up being one of the many thousands of American soldiers captured. But that doesn't even tell the whole story, because the German army, especially in the SS, but not just the SS, actually executed on battlefields many Allied soldiers. And that's something that Kurt Vonnegut talks about in his memoirs and in an incredible book called Armageddon in Retrospect, which I highly suggest. If you like Slaughterhouse-Five, Armageddon in Retrospect is a collection of essays that Vonnegut wrote about the war, and it's just really powerful. I highly suggest that it be one of your next stops after Slaughterhouse-Five. Vonnegut wants us to remember what a beautiful city Dresden was and how lovely it was. The movie, by the way, does a great job, because there's a sequence where when Vonnegut's group of POWs is disembarks from the train in Dresden, those who survived are marched through the central historical district of Dresden. And the camera pays very careful attention to the beautiful Gothic churches, the wonderful architecture, the ancient bridges, and it's just really just a beautiful city. Now, I want to warn you, in a few minutes, in a few seconds, actually, we're going to see some very graphic photographic imagery of the aftermath of the bombing of Dresden. So I just want to let you know that that's coming up. But Vonnegut wants us to remember all throughout that if you really have fought in a war, if you really have fought in combat, war is something you hate. It's something you despise. You don't valorize it. And this is one of the things he's trying to get across in Slaughterhouse. The passage I want to read for you is one of my favorite passages in all of literature. And I thought about, what passage would be most appropriate. And I thought, well, Vonnegut dedicated the book to Mary O'Hare. And Mary O'Hare, of course, was the wife of Bernard O'Hare, who actually served with Vonnegut and was interned in Dresden. And it's the reason why the novel is subtitled A Children's Crusade. And the backdrop to the sequence is that Kurt Vonnegut and Bernard O'Hare have just had a reunion after years of not seeing each other. They were POWs together. They survived the bombing of Dresden. They survived the terrible march from Belgium to Dresden, Germany, and the chaos of after war years. And they're talking now for the first time. And Vonnegut is having terrible writer's block. He would refer to Slaughterhouse-Five as his Dresden book over and over again. And people would say, when are you going to finish with your Dresden book? And he just couldn't get it going, right? And so he goes to Bernard O'Hare in an act of almost desperation to try to get from O'Hare what he remembers of the war. And his wife, Bernard O'Hare's wife, has served them some drinks. And she's in the background and being really noisy and slamming cupboards together and slamming the freezer door. And Vonnegut could tell Mrs. O'Hare is pissed off. And I think she's pissed off at me. And I wonder what's going on. And Mr. O'Hare says, oh, don't worry, she's okay. And Kurt Vonnegut's like, no, your wife is not okay. And so this is the backdrop to the sequence. Mary O'Hare turned to me and let me see how angry she was, and that the anger was for me. She had been talking to herself, so what she said was a fragment of a much larger conversation. You were just babies then, she said. What? I said, you were just babies in the war, like the ones upstairs, pointing to where her young children were. Vonnegut said, I nodded that this was true. We had been foolish virgins in the war, right at the end of childhood. But you're not going to write it that way, are you? This wasn't a question, it was an accusation. I don't know, I said. Well, I know, she said. You'll pretend you were men instead of babies. And you'll be played in the movies by Frank Sinatra and John Wayne, or some of those glamorous, war-loving, dirty old men. And war will look just wonderful. So we'll have a lot more of them. And they'll be fought by babies like the babies upstairs. So then I understood. It was war that made her so angry. She didn't want her babies or anybody else's babies killed in wars. And she thought wars were partly encouraged by books and movies. So I held up my right hand and I made her a promise. Mary, I said, I don't think this book of mine is ever going to be finished. I must have written 5,000 pages by now and thrown them all away. If I ever do finish it, though, I give you my word of honor. There won't be a part for Frank Sinatra or John Wayne. I tell you what, I said, I'll call it the Children's Crusade. She was my friend after that. And Vonnegut, of course, as you know, dedicates the book to her. So what did Kurt Vonnegut see in Dresden? He saw this beautiful ancient city. He believed that Dresden was almost, and he kind of romanticizes, sure, at certain points. He sees it as almost like an anti-Nazi city to a certain extent. He tells us he's done a lot of research after the war. Adolf Hitler very rarely ever stepped foot in Dresden. It wasn't his kind of place. And it wasn't considered to be a target of war. It was not heavily defended. There was a railroad that kind of went through and then skirted the city. Every night, people would hear bomber planes go over Dresden on their way to other targets, military targets in Germany, but they never stopped. And so there would be air raid sirens. People would go through the motions, go into makeshift bomb shelters, but never really took any of this seriously because they never believed that they were going to be hit by an Allied bombing offensive. And they were hit, and they were hit grievously. And the description, the horror of the firebombing in Dresden, and by the way, this is actually kept classified by the U.S. Air Force's historians, and the Army are actually allied, the Army Air Corps historians for many, many years. And there's a subplot in Slaughterhouse where the Harvard professor is trying to figure out, what happened in Dresden, because it's one of the few cases where a major bombing is, the documents around it are still being kept classified. Vonnegut describes it as hell on earth. He initially dramatically overestimates the number of people killed in Dresden. Initially, he said it was 250,000. Of course, we know it was closer to somewhere between 25 to 50,000 people killed in the immediate bombing. It's hard to tell because, again, Dresden was a place mainly for hospital convalescent people, POWs. A lot of people went to Dresden to try to get away from the ravages of war. But it met them that fateful evening in the firebombing. These are some pictures, and I want us to think about what Kurt Vonnegut was doing in the immediate days after the firebombing. He was sent out, the American, British, et cetera, POWs were sent out on burial detail, and they were literally digging through cellars and streets to try to find initially people to bury. And they found so many shocking things that some of the men that were on the burial detail lost their minds. And this was a process that Vonnegut, that really haunted him his entire life. And think about him as a humanist, trying to make sense of all of this. And one of the things that I really credit Slaughterhouse-Five for doing, although Vonnegut didn't really like to talk about the book this way, was to get people to understand the impact of war, the long term, the costs of war on civilian survivors, on military veteran survivors, and how we try to paper that over. And we have ticker tape parades at the end of the war. We talk about how much we value our veterans, et cetera, et cetera. But once the war breaks out, it's too late. And you see this process of Billy Pilgrim. Does he have what we call PTSD now? That's the way that some people teach the book. I'm not sure that's the most effective way to teach it, but clearly Billy Pilgrim, these impacts on him, the weeping, the sullenness, he's slipping backwards and forwards in time. Now there's a reason for that slippage. But again, I want us to think about what it would have been like for him, what it was like for him in those terrible days after the bombing, and having to deal with the bodies, the hundreds, then the thousands of people. And initially there was efforts to actually reinter or to bury the victims of the bombing, but there was just too many. And so they began being set on piers and literally burned and disposed of in that way. There's a story that Vonnegut tells in Armageddon in retrospect, which is implicit in Slaughterhouse-Five, which always sends chills through me, because again, I'm thinking of Kurt Vonnegut as a person who never really believes in God, a creator, a humanist, but whose experiences in Dresden make him believe in spirits. Wailing Shall Be in All Streets is one of the greatest essays I've ever read in any genre of any literature, certainly one of the greatest essays on the costs of war. And he and other POWs believe that so many people had died such terrible deaths in Dresden that their spirits somehow still animated the streets, and the survivors could hear them. They could hear the wailing at night. And again, Vonnegut was the least superstitious author I've ever read in my entire life, but this was something he believed because of his experiences. And to kind of wrap up as we move to Q&A, like Naylor, Heller, John Oliver Killens, other writers that came out of World War II, Vonnegut didn't just stop with World War II. He tried to always remind us really about the cost of war. I mean, there's so many passages in Slaughterhouse-Five that I would just love to read, and if just we had 3 or 4 hours. But Vonnegut returns to Dresden throughout his life many times. In a way that Howard Zinn returns to the south of France many times. Zinn was, of course, a bombardier during World War II. He flew on some of the last big missions of the Allied Air Command, the 1,000 bomber raids. Howard Zinn's experience from the air is almost like a corollary to Kurt Vonnegut's experiences as an infantry soldier. What I mean by this is that Howard Zinn was involved in some of these major bombings that occurred in France in the weeks before literally the war ended. And one of the bombings that occurred was one of the first uses of what became known as napalm. And Zinn's mission went awry somehow. And the napalm was dropped. Hundreds of planes were part of this bombing run. I think it was probably B-17s, like the ones that bombed Dresden. And they dropped napalm on French civilians. And Howard Zinn only found out about this, long after the mission had ended in World War II. But in later years, he went back to these villages that had been victimized by the bombing. And that was something that had such a deep impact. And Howard Zinn also believed that World War II was a necessary war to fight, that evil had to be confronted and defeated, but that there were things that happened in the war that were so terrible that one had to come to grips with them instead of turning away. And here this, one of the last quotes we'll see from Kurt Vonnegut is, he says, really, I would have given my life to save Dresden for the world's generations to come. That is how everyone should feel about every city on earth. And if I had to pick one quote from Kurt Vonnegut, I would pick this quote here. Just very powerful. Just to kind of wrap up, we're thinking about other novels to take a look at. And as you know, there are many great novelists who have also explored these same types of issues. The issue of innocence. Graham Greene, I reread this summer, The Quiet American. It's a spectacular book. It's such a good book. Graham Greene was a man so full of contradictions. He nailed it. You know, he's Quiet American is, if you read the book or if you haven't read the book, is set in what was known as French Indochina in the early 1950s during kind of the eclipse of French military power in what becomes Vietnam. And the Americans are beginning to go in and tell themselves and tell the world, hey, we have a different way of doing things. The French and the Europeans have failed. Their colonialism has failed. We have a way of managing third world nations to where it's going to work out for everyone. And the movie Quiet American is really incredible. Michael Caine, of course, here plays Fowler, the old British, kind of cynical British reporter. And he's like, you Americans are not as innocent as you think you are, but your innocence is what's going to get everyone here killed. So I think of Quiet American as a really very interesting corollary, or a book that I've read. I actually read it in tandem with Slaughterhouse-Five, which I reread for, I don't know, the umpteenth time preparing for this presentation today. Another work, of course, is Waiting for Barbarians by the Nobel laureate, J.M. Coetzee. Now here, the connection is seems to be a little more tenuous, but I argue that the two authors, again, are talking about the human condition, colonialism, war, what it does to people, and how what the author here is trying to get his readers to understand is the ways in which Europeans use colonialism to take out their violence on other people. In this case, the Barbarians, the novel, if you've read it, or if you haven't read it again, it's set in a very kind of nebulous kind of frontier colonial setting. The country it's set in is not given, the empire is not given. But again, I think the similarities in talking about oppression, violence, war, very similar to what Vonnegut was trying to get at in writing Slaughterhouse-Five. The last years of Kurt Vonnegut's life, very similar in many ways to James Baldwin. I think we've read James Baldwin together, where at a certain point, both writers decided, you know, hey, I've written 10, 12, 15 novels. You know, I've written enough. I need to start writing essays. And Vonnegut continued to write fiction, but his kind of nonfiction essays, if you will, really eclipsed his fiction. I think he had a syndicated column in the Progressive, maybe, I could be mistaken, but you encounter him a lot in the late 90s, and especially after War and Terror begins, writing these very powerful opinion pieces, op-eds, and he brings us right back to Florida in this passage about the election of 2000. This series of essays in A Man Without a Country is very important in understanding what Vonnegut is trying to get across to us. And again, this question of why he's banned. To Vonnegut, he has a much higher allegiance to humanity as a whole, as a humanist, a much higher allegiance to humanity than he does to a nation. And so for him, the idea of being a man without a country is sad. There's tragedy there, but there's also a sense of grim determination that I'm going to try to continue to get the people I love the most, you know, my fellow countrymen, to understand we've got to do better. We've got to do something different here than we have been doing. So I'll just conclude again with come back to the takeaways, some of the major themes in Vonnegut's writings, in Slaughterhouse-Five, in the essays, in the talks, in the lectures. And again, I'll share this with Mallory, and so you'll be able to kind of print off a copy of your own. But the idea is to try not to get trapped in history, to try to move on. The moving backwards and forwards in time is something that Vonnegut, by the way, he's in the Science Fiction Writers Hall of Fame, which was very amusing to him. He loves science fiction as a genre, but going backwards and forwards in time is a brilliant literary device, I believe. And something that Vonnegut, one of the slides I shared earlier, but I didn't really explain, Vonnegut tells us that the slippage in time, being unstuck in time, allows the reader to take a pause between all of the heavy scenes. And Vonnegut compares the being unstuck in time and time travel as being his Shakespearean device. Shakespeare would use a jester or an innkeeper or some kind of clown character to inject humor into his story in the midst of a lot of tragedy, right? And this is what Vonnegut was arguing, what he was doing with this idea of being unstuck in time. And I'll kind of stop there. I thank so much. Thank you for your attention. Kind of catching up in the chat bar. I see a lot of dear friends here, and I'll be happy to take questions for as long as you have questions.
Paul, we're navigating between the Oak Room and on Zoom here. So feel free to raise your hand on Zoom if you have any questions or comments here in the Oak Room.
Yeah, and while people are kind of getting organized, Mallory, I can look at the chat here. Phyllis mentioned Stephen Ambrose's works about World War II. Another really distinguished, very accessible author, Stephen Ambrose. Post-war Germany, yeah, I mean, the damages to these nations and countries, it takes years and sometimes decades. And some parts of Europe have not even been repaired after World War I. I mean, you can still find ruins if you go into countrysides. It's a very important point. And Dresden, I've heard, has been rebuilt incredibly. It is a city that I would like to visit also. But other questions for folks? I can't see the mic.
We have lots of hands here in the Oak Room. Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Keith Berg. And my question is maybe off topic, but I don't think so. And it is about whether the banning of certain kinds of speech is thanks to some of the laws passed in Florida recently, the woke laws and so forth, the extent to which maybe you personally and for the university as a whole, how much do you think that is affecting your ability to give lectures like you just gave to us?
Thank you for the question. It's really having an upsetting, terrible impact because, I'm a full professor. I'm very blessed to have job security. And so, I mean, I've written op-eds about this. I've said, I'm not changing anything. But if I was a graduate student or an assistant professor or a lecturer, or especially a K through 12 teacher, I have a lot of former students who are K through 12 teachers or who are assistant professors now in different places. And they live in fear. If you know a K through 12 teacher now, really take some time to spend with them and tell them what they do is so very important because they're under siege. We're under siege. Ideas are under siege right now. And it isn't just abstract ideas. It's the whole notion that the state is going to ban critical race theory or the 1619 slavery curriculum. And whatever you think of those, or whatever you think of Slaughterhouse, look, I mean, you may read Slaughterhouse-5, you may think, I don't think a sophomore should read that book. But just kind of keep in mind that that book really, this is one of the books that changed my life. If I had to pick one book or two books, I would pick Richard Wright's Native Son and Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-5 is a book which really woke me up. And were they upsetting? Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, really upsetting. Slaughterhouse-5 is really upsetting for a person who grows up in the shadow of people who have been mentally and physically incapacitated by war. And that was the milieu that I grew up in. So was reading it upsetting? Oh my gosh, yeah. But that's the whole point of why literature and ideas are important. they're important to kind of get us motivated to change our behaviors, to do things differently. So yeah, sadly, and I apologize, I better get off my my soapbox here, but yeah, I mean, the crisis is real. We are living in a crisis right now. And again, a lot of my former students who are K through 12 teachers are in the process of either leaving Florida or they've left. But the problem is that it isn't just Florida. I mean, I've been in DC this summer, and so it's really astonishing for me to walk down a street and see a Black Lives Matter banner hung out the side of the building, a public building. It's inspiring, it's really cool, but at the same time, I have to think back to my own city in Florida where a teacher was ordered by her principal. She had a Black Lives Matter flag in her class, and she was ordered to take it down and told that if you don't take this down, there will be repercussions. And there's a whole, I could tell you so many anecdotes about that and stories, which again remind us that we've got to step up now for freedom of speech, for the First Amendment, because it's under siege.
Okay, still here in the Oak Room?
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I just wanted to mention that we had a dear friend who died a few years ago who lived in Dresden when it was firebombed. She had an infant daughter and was married to a German pilot who had been killed. And in addition to the horror that she went through, she had to live in various camps, refugee camps, for a couple of years. And she said the only thing that saved her was that she spoke a variety of languages and she could speak whatever language of the army that was marching through. And she became a librarian, as a matter of fact, here at the University of Florida.
Wow, that's amazing.
Thank you very much for bringing this program to Oak-Hammock. I think the unsung terrible result of war is how many come back broken, and mentally and in many other ways. But I'm wondering if any of our current leaders are humanists, because that's another point you've brought up that I haven't really thought about. And when I see what's happening in Florida due to a narrow view of a Christian religion, I'm thinking how much we need humanists in office right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the great privilege of being able to speak before different humanist organizations about Kurt Vonnegut, and it's so incredible because there are people in these chapters who knew Vonnegut and who tell amazing stories about what it was like to interact with him. Humanism is, I believe it's a wonderful belief system, a way of living, and it's something, but it's not easy in this society, because I think a lot of us I was baptized Catholic. I mean, if you grow up Christian or one of the major religions in the society, it's easy to forget about, what it's like to not be a part of a major kind of mainstream religion. And it's something that Vonnegut would talk about, quite often. And again, I just want to reiterate, Vonnegut was not anti-religion. And he would often tell people, look, you sound really lonely. I suggest you join a church, and because he loved the kind of community that churches and synagogues and mosques could build. But he just didn't believe in the notion of a God that kind of controlled events. And I think that's one of the things that, gets him into trouble with some of the school districts. And this comes out more in other books like Breakfast of Champions or even Mother Night. If we think about a book to go, where would we go from here? It's hard to say. I mean, I would think, maybe Armageddon in retrospect, is the posthumously published series of essays that he wrote about war, but maybe Breakfast of Champions, because Breakfast of Champions is one of his novels that really, again, revisits this idea of how do you build a moral universe without a God. And it was a book that people found very troubling to read in the 70s.
Thank you. Anne Marie, go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. I'd like you to put on your faculty member hat again for just a minute because I used to be a faculty member and a department head in another state. And what, of course, concerns me is, thank goodness, so far you have had no repercussions or no retaliation as part of your career here at UF. But I'm concerned about what this new $3 million civic center that Keith Perry doesn't know where the money is coming from, what that's going to do in terms of not just affecting what kind of dialogue happens at the University of Florida among the faculty, but also what it does in terms of turning out future graduates. And I wondered if there's anything you would want to say about that.
Well, I mean, I was disappointed, like I think you were, and anyone should be, because the way that that center was set up, the lack of transparency for the funding. I mean, look, if we're a private institution, it's one question, but even a private institution would have more transparency if they're setting up a center. But I'm also a little envious because I have former students that if there would have been an open search for positions for a center like that. I have students that have gotten PhDs from the University of Florida that are the smartest young scholars in this country, and who teach civics already, who have been out in the field, who have I have a former student who just finished his PhD and did field work in Macomb, Mississippi, and has written the best. Will be publishing the best book, I think, on the civil rights movement in southern Mississippi for years and years to come. If there had been an open competition for that position at that civic center, this student might have gotten the job. But the sad truth is there wasn't an open competition. So that's, to me, what's also problematic about it is we're having an increasing number of cases where our the legislators and our administrators are losing touch about what made University of Florida, how we built the university, who built it, by the students, the staff, the faculty, and bringing in this stuff from the outside is really tragic. And it's causing a lot of people to doubt the integrity of the university. And it's just really sad to see.
Thank you. Other questions here in the Oak Room?
Hey, Paul, Nicole Nesberg here. Hope you're doing good up there.
Hey, Nicole.
As a parent of an elementary school kid, how would you tell us to advocate here in Gainesville or here in Florida for our children and their teachers?
Well, it's a really critical question. And I would say that, I mean, the positive side of this crisis that we're talking about, and it is a crisis, I really believe that the Republic is in a crisis moment, but the reason it's a crisis, the reason that these states are passing laws against the First Amendment, against freedom of thought, against books, is they know the ground is changing underneath them. And I know this because I hear from school districts all across the country who are calling me in and calling other people in and saying, look, Professor Ortiz, we need to revise our history curriculum. We want to make it more inclusive. We need to have more women in the story. We need to have, if we're teaching, the history of Florida, we need to have Haitian people in the story. We need to have Cubans in the story. Oh, and by the way, Cuba has a history before 1959. And so let's recognize that, right? And so this is what I mean by the ground is shifting underneath our feet. Younger people, their parents, teachers, faculty have been changing the way we look at history. Now, I'm just thinking about history now because I'm a historian. But people in the state level realize that. They don't like it because whenever you change the narrative, it gives people a sense of new possibilities, a sense of new connections, a new way of looking at the world. And maybe you might decide, hey, I think the current system needs to be, shaken up a little bit. And that's what the people in power right now don't want to see. I think that's what we can do, I think, as supporters of public education is let's counter, a lot of these reactionaries who are trying to take books out of schools. They may show up as 5 or 10 or 15 people at a school district meeting. Well, we need to have 5 or 10 or 15 people who show up who say, no, we're not going to stand for this. When Don Bidwell assigned Slaughterhouse-5, there was, and this isn't just confined to red states, by the way, Anne Marie, that's a very important observation. When Don Bidwell assigned Slaughterhouse-5 in 1981, I guarantee you it was controversial. But there were a number of parents who stepped up and said, you know, yeah, these passages may make us feel uncomfortable, but we feel like this is an important book for our students to read, if only that's going to help them get into college. And that was the trump card that Don Bidwell played. If he's on the line, I think it's safe to give away his secret now, but that's how he played it. He was a Navy veteran himself. He wasn't a person who would bang his fist on the table. He wasn't a person who would have a big picket sign, but he would tell the PTA, the principal, the superintendent, look, I know Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar is a tough read. I know Catcher in the Rye has some mature sequences. You know, I know Richard Wright's Native Son or Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man has some very disturbing parts to the novel, but you have to understand that this is what it takes to get kids into the University of Washington. Mm-hmm. And that's as simple as that. And so that, you know, there's different strategies I think we can use to save books, to keep them from being banned. But let's also think about protecting our teachers, lifting up our K through 12 teachers, you know, take them out, you know, this sounds banal maybe, but, you know, show them how much you care. Why should they have to pay for their own supplies in class? Let's step up and help them do that.
Thank you, Paul. Lynn Ryan, go ahead.
Hi, about 20 years ago, I was a docent with the Cincinnati Art Museum, and every year we'd go to Europe to look at some art museums. We went through Germany without any trouble till we got to Dresden. When we entered the museum, we were treated very hostilely. People would not talk to us, they'd look away. They didn't honor our tickets until we made a big fuss. And at the end of the visit, I asked our guide, who was German, but not from Dresden, why did we run into this? I wasn't familiar with the history. And she told me that the Dresden folks think that the bombing of Dresden was completely unnecessary because the war was, in all essence, completely over anyway. The other thing that lasted a while was our Jewish docents wouldn't go to Germany. They didn't want to have anything to do with Germany, even though we were just visiting art museums. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, these are really important observations. And, you know, Vonnegut fielded questions about Dresden when the book first came out, and people would say, well, so what you're saying is we were on the wrong side, or you're claiming the Holocaust didn't happen. And he was saying, no, I'm not saying any of that. And again, to his dying day, I believe, even though he was anti-war to the core, he still felt like, and this is similar to Howard Zinn, who's very anti-war, very similar. They felt that World War II was a war we had to fight. We had to take it to Germany, as tragic as that was. But he wanted to find a way to tell us there had to be limits even in this situation in 1945. And he drew the line at Dresden. And he didn't retreat from that. And he was involved in some really big kind of titanic debates. You can find some of these on YouTube, by the way, in the early 70s, because people would go right at him and say, well, Mr. Vonnegut, it seems like your novel is an apology for Nazism. And nothing would infuriate him more than that. He would just, rarely ever saw him lose temper. But, there's also, it comes to mind, there's a recent film that just came out last year, a young Mallory, I'll give you the title of the film. I just found out about this film. And it was a young filmmaker who had a series of conversations with Vonnegut on some of these topics over decades, and just never finished it when Vonnegut was alive. But that could shed a little bit of light on especially what he was thinking of towards the end of his life.
Okay, if we don't have any additional questions, then I just want to thank Paul for a wonderful session. We really appreciate his insights and the information that he gave. And good to see you, Paul. Also, I just hope that everyone here at ILR has gotten something from our efforts here. It was really amazing to work on this course and with Julie and early on with Ellen and to put it together. And it's something that I feel very strongly about. And I think we've had some wonderful people to share their insights with us. So thank you all for being involved in it and just keep on reading.
All right, Paul, standing invitation whenever you get here. Come have lunch with us.
All right, I look forward to that. Well, Julian, hey, everyone, be well, be safe. Again, support your K through 12 teachers. And, we need your support at the University of Florida. Now that we've finished, I can thank everyone here for being just so supportive of the United Faculty of Florida. And, we love our university, but now's the time to step up for it because we are in a crisis moment. And we've got to remind the folks who run the system that we're just not going to allow them to take an institution that we're people in this room have worked so hard to build academic freedom, great programs, great departments, generations of fabulous students. We're not going to let the people in power take that away. So thank you so much for taking the stances that you take. And we're just going to keep moving together, all right? So I better zoom off now, Julie, but
Okay.
thank you again for setting it up and look forward to having that lunch soon.
Okay, be well.
Okay, well, bye.